There's a special category of corporate disaster reserved exclusively for companies that held the ultimate winning hand and somehow still managed to fold. Picture the absolute perfect setup for dominating the modern e-commerce landscape. You already possess massive regional distribution hubs humming with activity, a fleet of delivery trucks crisscrossing the country, and the unquestioning trust of millions of customers. You've essentially built the internet shopping experience before the internet even exists, meaning all you have to do is wait for the technology to catch up to your logistics network. That was the exact reality for Sears Canada. They were a retail colossus that had already perfected the art of distance shopping long before the first website was even coded. If you grew up anywhere in Canada before the new millennium, you were familiar with the Sears Wish Book. It was this massive catalog that arrived in the mail every single year to bring the entire consumer world directly to your kitchen table. The premise was incredibly simple. You could flip to a random page, circle a brand new refrigerator or a winter coat with a pen, dial a phone number, and have that exact item arrive at your front door a few days later. This was revolutionary back then. They had built a flawless end-to-end delivery machine that handled everything from power tools to entire bedroom furniture sets, completely bypassing the need for a customer to ever set foot inside a physical store. When the digital age finally dawned, the path forward should have been the most straightforward pivot in corporate history. Sears Canada possessed the exact physical infrastructure required to absolutely dominate the 21st century. All the executives had to do was take the contents of that paper wish book and translate them onto a digital screen by plugging a basic website into the world-class supply chain they'd already spent decades building. Yet, somehow, they completely fumbled the transition. They watched from the sidelines as newcomers stole their market share using the exact same distance shopping model that Sears had practically invented. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most frustrating and fascinating corporate blunders ever recorded. We're going to look closely at how a company with a virtual monopoly on the Canadian department store sector was systematically driven into the ground, exploring the hidden decisions and boardroom missteps that caused the catalog kings to ultimately lose their crown. Long before the digital failures and the final boardroom disasters, Sears Canada was an unstoppable juggernaut. In 1952, American retail heavyweight Sears, Roebuck & Co. looked across the northern border and saw massive untapped potential. They teamed up with the already established Canadian retailer Simpsons, launching a joint venture cleverly named Simpsons Sears that immediately set their sights on conquering the rapidly expanding Canadian suburbs. The core strategy relied on overwhelming physical presence. As real estate developers began paving over farmland to build the country's first enclosed shopping malls, Simpsons Sears was right there signing the paperwork to become the premier anchor tenant. This footprint made them the absolute default destination for an entire generation of middle-class families setting up their lives. Whenever a Canadian homeowner needed a reliable new lawnmower, they drove straight to the mall to buy a Craftsman at Sears. When a growing family needed a washing machine that wouldn't break down, they purchased a Kenmore at the local Sears. The brand seamlessly embedded itself into the everyday mechanics of Canadian domestic life, becoming as ubiquitous and trusted as the postal service. This suburban dominance carried the company comfortably for decades, pushing them toward the absolute peak of their power in the late 1990s, when the Canadian retail landscape experienced a massive seismic shift. Eaton's, the historic department store chain and the only truly formidable rival Sears faced on a national scale, completely collapsed and filed for bankruptcy in 1999. With their biggest competitor bleeding out on the floor, Sears wasted no time, and they swooped in and aggressively purchased the absolute best parts of the remaining corporate carcass. Sears effectively secured a total monopoly on the department store format, driving their sales figures to record highs and sending their stock price steadily climbing as the executives took their victory laps. But taking a victory lap is dangerous when the race isn't actually over. When a corporation achieves that kind of absolute, unchallenged monopoly, a very specific and highly toxic psychological shift happens inside the boardroom. The executives simply stop looking over their shoulders. Because they had captured the Canadian market so thoroughly, the leadership team genuinely believed the competition no longer existed, which caused them to stop treating the company like a living, breathing entity that required constant innovation to survive. They started treating the entire retail chain like a giant ATM. The overarching corporate strategy pivoted away from growth and customer acquisition, shifting entirely towards simple maintenance and aggressive profit extraction. They operated under the fatal assumption that the Canadian consumer would always walk through their glass doors simply because there was nowhere else to go. That exact arrogance blinded them to the technological earthquake happening right under their feet. As the early 2000s brought high-speed internet directly into millions of homes, everyday customers were discovering the effortless convenience of clicking a mouse and having a package dropped right at their front door. And while a ruthless young startup called Amazon was pouring money into this new digital frontier, the leadership at Sears was busy looking in the complete opposite direction. This was the critical window where Sears Canada needed to act aggressively. They already possessed the physical warehouses, the supplier relationships, and the nationwide delivery network required to absolutely crush Amazon in the Canadian market before the startup even gained a proper foothold. All they had to do was plug a functional e-commerce platform into their existing logistics machine. Instead, the executives completely failed to understand the assignment, treating the internet as a passing novelty rather than the fundamental future of global commerce. Because it was viewed as a gimmick, the early iterations of the Sears Canada website were an operational disaster. The search functions were broken and deeply frustrating to navigate, and worst of all, the online interface was completely disconnected from the actual physical warehouses. A customer could easily spend 20 minutes fighting the website to order a pair of winter boots, only to receive an automated email 2 weeks later stating the item was actually out of stock. Management treated the entire digital storefront as a low-priority side project, stubbornly continuing to pour hundreds of millions of dollars into printing massive runs of their paper catalog while their digital competitors quietly built the future. And while Sears Canada was busy burying its head in the sand regarding the digital revolution, the financial reality of the situation slowly began to rot the foundation of the business. Revenue started to severely plateau as fewer people bothered making the drive to the local mall to wander through those massive aging anchor stores. This slow, predictable stagnation in foot traffic is exactly the kind of blood in the water that attracts a very specific type of financial operator on Wall Street. Enter Eddie Lampert. Lampert was a highly successful hedge fund manager who had just orchestrated one of the most aggressive financial maneuvers of the early 2000s by taking control of the struggling American Sears Roebuck company and merging it with Kmart to create a giant holding company. Because this American parent corporation owned a controlling stake in the Canadian operation, Lampert effectively acquired the keys to the Sears Canada kingdom by default, making him the ultimate boss of the entire northern operation. Lampert approached the business purely through the lens of a ruthless financier. He saw nothing but a massive, wildly undervalued portfolio of prime real estate. Driven by a corporate philosophy of extreme cost-cutting, he firmly believed he could squeeze a fortune in short-term cash out of the business simply by slashing the daily operating budgets to the absolute bone. Applying that kind of spreadsheet logic is absolutely devastating in the retail sector because shopping is a highly visual and deeply physical experience for the customer. When a corporation suddenly stops injecting capital back into basic store maintenance, the physical decay happens at a terrifying speed. Under Lampert's strict financial regime, Sears Canada practically ceased all renovations across its massive fleet of locations. Paint began peeling off the walls, overhead lighting fixtures would burn out and sit completely dark for months on end, and the carpets became heavily stained and visibly worn down by years of neglected foot traffic. By the year 2010, walking into a local Sears store felt like stepping into a dusty retail time capsule that had been completely abandoned by upper management. That overwhelming visual decay triggered a massive, unseen crisis behind the scenes. Premium brands and clothing manufacturers spend millions of dollars carefully curating their public image, so when their representatives walked into a Sears Canada location and saw their expensive merchandise sitting on broken shelves under flickering fluorescent lights, they completely panicked. Major labels flatly refused to let their products be associated with a building that looked like a failing thrift shop, abruptly pulling their premium jeans and high-end jackets straight off the floor. This mass exodus created an immediate and glaring inventory problem. Having lost access to the popular high-margin brands that actually drive foot traffic, Sears was forced to fill the massive empty spaces on their sales floors with lower-tier merchandise and their own rapidly aging in-house labels. In fact, things got so grim that retail surveys from the era revealed that female shoppers increasingly preferred hunting for clothes at discount racks or even local Goodwill stores rather than stepping foot inside a Sears. The bleeding didn't stop at the apparel section. As the company's overall financial stability came into serious question, the massive corporations manufacturing the televisions, toys, and household appliances started paying very close attention to the Sears balance sheet. Terrified that the retailer would soon be completely unable to pay its invoices, these heavy-hitting suppliers fundamentally changed the rules of engagement. To protect their own bottom lines, vendors began demanding strict upfront cash payments before they would allow a single box of inventory to be loaded onto a delivery truck. That single demand completely shattered their supply chain. Sears simply didn't have the liquid cash required to pay for everything in advance, leaving them completely unable to keep popular, heavily promoted items in stock. A loyal customer would make the 30-minute drive out to the suburban mall specifically to buy an advertised appliance, only to be greeted by empty floor space and a highly apologetic sales clerk. Sears Canada responded to all this with absolute corporate whiplash. In a brutally chaotic 4-year stretch between 2013 and 2017, the company burned through 5 different chief executive officers. Every time a new CEO walked into the building, they brought a sweeping, highly publicized turnaround plan with them. They would burn through millions of dollars launching fresh initiatives and internal campaigns, only to resign or get abruptly pushed out 12 months later. The ink would barely be dry on the previous strategy before the next executive arrived, immediately scrapped the entire project, and restarted the disastrous cycle from scratch. As the daily retail operations aggressively bled cash, with fewer washing machines and winter coats moving out the doors every single quarter, management desperately needed to create the illusion of profitability. To keep the investors satisfied, they activated a strategy that essentially amounted to a massive corporate strip mine, targeting the only remaining asset of true value the company possessed. Sears Canada had anchored almost every major shopping mall built across the country decades earlier, holding incredibly valuable long-term leases locked in at highly favorable historical rates. The executives quickly realized that the sheer physical square footage they controlled was now worth significantly more in the open market than the actual retail business operating inside of it. Armed with this realization, management began systematically selling off their absolute best and most lucrative locations. They went directly to the wealthy shopping mall landlords and offered to break their ironclad leases early in exchange for massive cash payouts. This aggressive liquidation campaign meant surrendering the historic multi-level flagship location at the Toronto Eaton Centre and permanently closing down their premium high-traffic anchors in massive urban markets like Vancouver and Calgary. Giving up those crown jewel locations generated hundreds of millions of dollars in instant liquid cash for the company. A healthy, forward-thinking corporation would naturally take that massive capital injection and immediately reinvest it into upgrading their disastrous digital infrastructure or modernizing the remaining store fleet to win back customers. Sears Canada took that money and authorized the exact opposite though. The board of directors decided to just hand the cash directly to the company's owners. And because Eddie Lampert's American investment firm owned the biggest chunk of Sears Canada, they instantly scooped up the vast majority of the payout. To put it simply, the hundreds of millions of dollars created by selling off historic Canadian real estate was sucked right out of the struggling retail chain and dumped straight into the pockets of Wall Street hedge fund managers. With the real estate crown jewels sold off and the remaining store fleet bleeding cash at an unprecedented rate, absolute desperation finally took hold of the executive suite. Enter Brandon Stranzel, the executive tasked with orchestrating a radical 11th hour reinvention of the brand. Recognizing that the traditional, sprawling department store model was effectively dead in the water, Stranzel decided on a massive pivot to fundamentally change the company's identity by pushing Sears Canada headfirst into the off-price retail sector. The overarching strategy was to aggressively mimic the massive success of discount giants like Winners or Marshalls, which were absolutely thriving by offering customers a highly addictive, fast-paced treasure hunt shopping atmosphere. To signal this massive shift to the public, Sears introduced a brand new, modernized logo that completely abandoned their classic, highly recognizable blue and white aesthetic. Inside the buildings, they started frantically redesigning the floor plans, ripping out the traditional department displays and replacing them with chaotic bargain bins and crowded clearance racks. However, the entire initiative collapsed almost immediately upon launch because simply slapping a trendy logo on the side of a decaying building does absolutely nothing to erase a decade of consumer neglect. The Canadian public had spent the previous 10 years watching Sears slowly rot from the inside out while completely failing to deliver even the most basic online shopping functionality. Shoppers took one look at the new discount strategy and saw it for exactly what it was: a desperate, last-ditch cash grab from a dying empire. The underlying logistics of the off-price market also proved to be a fatal blind spot for the executive team. That specific retail sector is fiercely competitive and entirely dominated by entrenched companies that have spent decades perfecting the highly complex supply chain required to quickly buy, sort, and distribute excess inventory. Sears Canada was attempting to learn a highly specialized, completely new business model on the fly while simultaneously bleeding hundreds of millions of dollars every single quarter. The general public completely rejected the rebrand, leaving the newly configured discount stores entirely empty as the company's final cash reserves drained away at an alarming, unstoppable rate. The basic laws of mathematics finally caught up with Sears Canada in the summer of 2017. Having already sold off all their valuable real estate and completely exhausted their remaining credit lines, the daily retail operations were now generating catastrophic losses every single month. The company had literally run out of the actual physical money required to keep the lights on in the stores and the supply trucks moving on the highways. In June of 2017, the company officially filed for creditor protection under the Companies Creditors Arrangement Act, which functions as the Canadian equivalent of a Chapter 11 bankruptcy. After a failed attempt of restructuring the company, the courts ordered a total corporate liquidation, triggering a massive countrywide process of physically tearing the historic company apart. Almost overnight, the iconic blue Sears signs that had anchored Canadian malls for decades were covered up by massive yellow and black banners screaming, "Everything must go." At the exact moment the liquidation order was signed, Sears Canada employed roughly 16,000 people. Because the corporate entity was declared completely insolvent and entirely out of cash, every single one of those workers was immediately terminated with absolutely zero severance pay. People who had spent 3 decades of their lives faithfully working the retail floors, managing the distribution warehouses, and running the customer service call centers were simply sent home with nothing, leaving thousands of families suddenly scrambling to cover their mortgages and rent. The scandal surrounding the employee pension plan proved to be even more devastating. For years leading up to the final bankruptcy filing, the Sears Canada executive team had consistently failed to adequately fund the retirement accounts of its employees. When the accountants finally tallied the remaining assets during the liquidation, they discovered the pension plan was sitting on a massive, glaring deficit hovering around $267 million. The cruelty of this deficit comes down to the strict legal hierarchy of how bankruptcy law actually distributes the remaining scraps of a dead company. Secured creditors, massive banks, and the liquidation firms themselves are legally positioned at the very front of the line to collect whatever cash is generated from selling off the inventory. The retired employees, who relied on those pensions to survive, are pushed to the absolute back of the line. Because the money ran out before it reached them, retirees across the country watched in horror as their monthly pension checks were permanently slashed, severely degrading their quality of life for their final years. The public fury was immense because the hypocrisy of the situation was completely undeniable. The exact same board of directors who had recently authorized hundreds of millions of dollars in special cash payouts to enrich wealthy American hedge funds had simultaneously allowed the employee pension fund to starve. When the dust finally settled on that brutal liquidation, the sheer scale of the collapse sent shockwaves through the entire Canadian commercial real estate market. Across the country, those massive, multi-level anchor locations that once defined the suburban shopping experience sat completely empty and dark. Landlords were suddenly stuck with millions of square feet of cavernous space that was practically impossible to fill with a single tenant, forcing major shopping centers to spend absolute fortunes physically carving up the old Sears footprint into smaller, chopped-up units just to desperately attract grocery stores, fitness centers, or multiplex cinemas to fill the void. Looking over the wreckage of this retail empire, the fundamental tragedy is just how easily this entire disaster could have been avoided. The company collapsed entirely due to their own stubborn refusal to acknowledge the reality of the digital age. Sears Canada actually enjoyed a massive 20-year head start on Amazon with their sprawling distribution warehouses, national fleet of delivery trucks, and the exact logistical blueprint required for distant shopping. They held the absolute trust of the Canadian consumer and owned every single physical ingredient necessary to absolutely dominate the upcoming e-commerce era. But instead, they stubbornly clung to their massive paper catalogs and aging physical stores. The downfall of Sears Canada stands as the ultimate proof that historic legacy and widespread brand recognition can't save a corporation that refuses to adapt to shifting consumer behavior. The undisputed kings of the mail order catalog completely misunderstood the basic mechanics of the digital world, and that arrogance ultimately cost them an empire. But what do you guys think? Are you someone who grew up circling toys in the holiday wish book? Or had you already completely abandoned Sears for Amazon long before they finally pulled the plug? Drop your memories and thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into corporate failure, give us a like, hit subscribe, and ring that bell so you never miss the next video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, stay curious.